This is Joseph Carpenter. Today is December 19th, 2023, and I'm interviewing Alex Andrews for the first time. This interview is taking place at University Hall on the campus of the University of Texas at Arlington. This interview is sponsored by the UTA History Department, College of Liberal Arts, and is part of the Maverick Veterans Voices Project. Welcome, and thank you for being here, sir.
You're welcome.
Tell me, where are you from originally, and tell me a little bit about your growing up.
Well, I'm a native Texan. I was born in Midland, Texas, but my folks moved to the Dallas area when I was 2 years old. And when I was 10, we moved out to Garland, Texas, so I went to Garland High School, and after that I went down to Austin to the University of Texas Engineering School.
I see. And were you involved in ROTC in high school?
I was not.
Okay. And what about college?
Not in college either.
Were there any family members that were members of the military?
I was the first family member to be in the military.
Is that right? So how did you become interested in the military then?
There was a neighbor who lived across the street from us who was a retired naval officer. And I think that he probably got me interested in the Navy. At that time, the draft was in effect. As long as you were in college, you got a deferment. So my senior year of engineering school, which would have been 1966, 67, I went down to the recruiting station. I still remember the address, 1114 Commerce Street, the Santa Fe building. And I just walked in the office of the Navy and said that I was getting ready to graduate from college. I'd like to join. And how do I get a commission? And they said, well, you take this test. And then when the test was over with, they said, you'll probably hear from us later. So I was offered the chance to go to officer school once I got out. And I finished everything but one 3-hour course down at UT Austin.
Right.
In the summer of 1967, I still needed a 3-hour math course to graduate. And I had to graduate before I could go to OCS in the Navy.
Right.
So I came over here to UT Arlington, signed up for the differential equations course. The name I remember, I'm not too sure I remember much of the content of it. And
that's the name of the course, though. Do you remember your professor by any chance?
I do not remember the gentleman.
And how did you choose UT Austin as where you would attend college?
My father graduated from TCU, and I actually have some pictures of my sister and I standing next to him when he graduated, because he too lacked a 3-hour course, I think, in English, and he picked it up at SMU. So about 1950, we went over to watch him graduate. And from time to time, he would take me over during the fall to watch TCU play football. So I had an affinity to TCU, and I told him that I'd like to go to TCU. And he told me that he couldn't afford to send me to TCU, but he would help me go to Tech or Texas or A&M, and I chose Texas.
I see. He wouldn't help you go to UTA?
At that time, I don't think they called it UTA, did they?
Yeah, it was Arlington State
Arlington
College
State
at that
College.
time, right?
I had been over here in the high school band and band competitions before.
Yes.
No, he didn't mention UTA.
Well, that's okay. You have the one course then.
Yes.
Okay. And your major was
Architectural engineering.
Architectural engineering. Okay.
Which is a structural engineering course at Texas.
Why did you choose that major?
During the summertime, I had a job in Grand Prairie with a steel fabricator. And I was very fortunate. The president of that company, when I went over and asked him for a summer job, he gave me the yellow pages of the phone book, open to architects in Dallas. And he gave me a box full of fountain pens and cigarette lighters and said, I want you to call on each of these firms all summer long, as many as you can, and tell them about our fabrication operation here. So I think that was my introduction to structural engineering.
It could have led to a job in sales as well, couldn't it?
Yeah, I guess it could have.
Was there anyone on the faculty at UT that influenced you?
Well, they taught me, but the decision to go there I made without any faculty input.
And what about during your time there?
We had to go to the School of Architecture and take design courses so that we could appreciate these architects that we realized that pretty much control the design of a project, but the structural engineer makes it stand up. And when I was a sophomore, my mother called one day and told me that my dad had collapsed and died on a golf course in Fort Worth.
Oh my.
And he was working for the Army at that time. And so I came home and she said, after we take care of his affairs, you're going back to school and don't even think about dropping out. And I remember I had a design class, an architectural design class. And I was back sitting in the lab, and it was taught by an architect. His name was Barton D. Riley of Austin. And my classmates were busy working on their design, and I was sitting there doing nothing. And he knew that I had gone home because of my dad. And he came around, and I will never forget this incident. He took my hand with my pen in it, and he started drawing on my paper there. And just, he didn't say anything to me. He just knew why I was not functioning at all. And after a while, I picked it up and started doing it again. But that was probably the kindest thing that anybody ever did during that time of sadness when my dad died.
He didn't say anything.
He didn't say anything to me.
Wow.
He talked about the project, but he didn't talk about that he understood why I was feeling bad or anything.
Yes.
And I later learned that he was a Marine Corps veteran during World War II and had been to Iwo Jima. And yet there was nothing gruff and rough about him, just very kind.
Yes. Wow. Let's back up a little bit and talk about your parents. What did your dad do for a living? You mentioned he graduated from, or attended TCU.
He graduated from TCU, and I saw him graduate.
Right.
He was a CPA.
Okay.
So that's how he made his living. And Mother took care of the house.
I see. Okay. And did you have any siblings?
I have an older sister, 4 years older, who went to Texas Tech and got a degree in education and then married an Air Force pilot out from Reese Air Force Base out there.
Yeah. And just an older sister, not another sibling?
Just the one sister.
Just the one sister, okay. And were you commissioned upon graduation? I enlisted in the Navy, and yes.
you're considered an enlisted person through the 16 weeks of officer school. And upon graduation from officer school, then I was commissioned an ensign in the Navy.
And what was your first assignment?
First assignment was to join a Navy construction battalion, otherwise known as the Seabees, at Chu-Lai, South Vietnam, 2-3 days after the Tet Offensive had started in 1968.
How did you feel about going to Vietnam?
I had no desire to, I remember very clearly. Clearly I had no desire to get hurt. I didn't have any desire to go kill anybody.
Right.
And I made the assumption that things would be rather safe. Of course, I didn't know what a Tet Offensive was.
Sure.
So I volunteered to go, so
yes.
I didn't have any hesitation to go.
What about your mom?
She was supportive of me.
Was she?
Yeah.
So she wasn't saying to you, please don't go, anything like that? She was.
No, I just remember when our neighbor drove me to Love Field to get on the airplane, that I remember her crying.
Oh.
So.
Yeah, and you were in Vietnam a relatively short time, though.
The Seabees were sent to Vietnam for 8 months at a time. Then they were brought back to their home port for 6 months, where they picked up new people, discharged people, and then were sent back to Vietnam for 8 months. So I had a 36-month commitment, and if you do the timeline, I could have spent 3 tours of 8 months or 2 years in Vietnam. Because of a quirk of fate, I only spent about 6 weeks in Vietnam. I caught the tail end of the tour in February of '68, and when we were scheduled to go back 6 months later, they made the decision that they needed some Seabees down in the Caribbean, which we used to joke was not necessarily a hotbed of activity.
Right.
So they sent us to Roosevelt Roads, Puerto Rico,
Okay.
and we conducted a Seabee camp. We went down Christmas Day of '68 and came home in early June of '69.
Explain what your job was in the Seabees exactly, because you weren't a civil engineer, so...
I had every job that had nothing to do with construction. I was what the Army calls, or the Navy Seabees call, the S1, Staff Position 1.
Okay.
I was the admin officer, the personnel officer. The Navy sent me to Naval Justice School, and so I became the legal officer. And then I was also given a collateral duty called the Special Services Officer, which meant that I was to do things to keep morale up.
I see.
In Vietnam, the first thing they told me to do was they said, these 3 enlisted men will report to you, and you'll be sure that this battalion does not run out of beer and soda while we're here.
That was the extent of your duty in Vietnam.
That was the extent of my duty in Vietnam. When we got back home from Vietnam, that's when they made me the S1.
I see.
So
Okay.
I have some pictures over there, and I could pass for 16 years old when I was really 24 in an ensign in the Navy.
Wow. And so how much time did you spend in the Caribbean then?
We spent right at 5 months, 6 months.
Okay.
And I had a whole staff of people to take care of the admin and the personnel. So the special services part, my job was to, it wasn't a job given to me, I just created it. I drove into San Juan. If you've ever been to Las Vegas with the hotels with gambling casinos, well, San Juan also has hotels with gambling casinos, much smaller bases. And I used to pay cold calls on the public relations people at the hotels and prevail upon them to let me talk to their nightly entertainers and bring them down for daytime shows to keep morale up among our 500 guys who were out there working 6.5 days a week out in the sun.
Wow. So other than that, as you had a degree in structural architecture, is that?
I had an engineering degree in architectural engineering.
Okay. And did you do anything related to that?
While in the Seabees, from time to time, something structural would come up and they would include me to talk about it. But keep in mind that I was a fresh graduate and had not been out in the design world doing anything. Maybe we can talk later about the time, though, that when I went to work for Rutgers University, we built a building down there that was a 2-story building. And on the first floor, the students' eating facilities were there, but on the second floor, the faculty and staff ate. And from the day that building opened, our telephone started ringing with the dining services people asking us, is this building safe? And they actually called my boss, they didn't call me. And he called me in and said, would you go find out what's going on over there? They're saying that building is shaking whenever people walk across the floor. And so I did go over there, and by that time, I was much more familiar with structural steel and design. But I told the project manager to call his architect and engineer and ask them to send over their vibration calculations. And they told us that they didn't do any vibration calculations. And I pulled out the code where it clearly says they have to do that.
Right.
And that led to, we're talking about working at Rutgers University in New Jersey.
Right.
And that led us into, the structural engineer on the job was, in fact, a stand-up guy. He called the world expert who happened to be not far away at Virginia Tech. And he came over, and I had the assignment to meet him at his hotel and to shepherd him around the university and to this floor. And I got to be his gopher. Now, I'd pretty much been a gopher as an ensign in the Navy, and here I was many years later being a gopher again. But it introduced me to designing for vibration. And I came to find out that not every engineering school does that to their undergraduates. I had 2 professors in the state of Texas at 2 different universities. When I asked them, how do you teach for vibration to your students, tell me that they didn't have enough time to do that and that they'd have to learn it out on the job. And I was very surprised to do that. So we ultimately fixed the problem, but it was very costly to do it. They just had, the engineer had specified too light of beams. Had he specified deeper beams, stiffer beams, walking would not have caused it to vibrate.
So there was some justification in the question about whether or not the building was safe.
That's right. It was very disturbing to the people.
Sure.
It wasn't going to fall down.
Right.
We determined that very quickly, but it was certainly going to be annoying. And annoying, the code actually uses that word to
Does it?
be sure that your serviceability isn't annoying to people.
That's interesting. I wouldn't have expected that. So backing up just a little bit back to the Navy. So you were in the Caribbean for about 8 months. What did you do?
In the Caribbean for about 5.5 months.
Oh, 5.5 months. Okay.
Yes.
Altogether, how long did you serve in the Navy?
4 years.
Okay. And what did you do for the rest of the time that you were there?
2 years were attached to the Seabees. If we weren't deployed to Vietnam or we weren't deployed to the Caribbean, we were in our home port in Davisville, Rhode Island.
Okay.
That was a full 2 years.
Okay.
The next 2 years I was stationed at Tsugi Naval Air Station in Japan, which is an air station right outside of Tokyo. And I was attached to the Public Works Department, and I was in charge of contracts for new construction projects.
Okay. And do you feel like your training either at UT or in the Navy or both combined prepared you for the positions that you were taking on, or did you have to learn those things kind of on the fly?
In the service or out of the service?
Both.
In the service, you always had a staff of people. You signed a lot of paper, but they did a lot of work.
Okay.
And out of the service, being the assistant resident officer in charge of construction at Itsugi, Japan, helped my career because I spent a lot of time managing construction projects, particularly like the Dallas schools in the 80s. I worked for a company that we were hired to hire all the architects and to manage the contractors, where we had to do something to 200 schools. And
Something.
we either built a new school, or we put an addition on a school,
I see.
or we renovated
Right.
a school.
Right.
And so the Navy and the undergraduate all worked together. Later, did the same thing down in Austin for the Eanes School District. And when we were finishing up the Eanes School District was when one day I got a telephone call from the vice president of facilities at Rutgers. Rutgers is the State University of New Jersey. And he said he was coming to Austin to watch Rutgers play Texas, and he'd like to take my wife and myself to the game. I remember that he said, well, the only thing is you're going to have to sit among a group of Rutgers people because all of our tickets are the same location.
Right.
And I said, well, Dick, we know how to behave. I also remember that Rutgers scored first in that game, and many of the people stood up with their cameras taking a picture of the scoreboard. I said, Dick, why are these people taking a picture of the scoreboard? And his answer was, well, at Rutgers football, we're not accustomed to being ahead. So anyway, he really did not offer me a job at Rutgers. He just told me that they were looking for a director of construction management. And I said, I'm getting ready to finish up this consulting job here in Austin, and so I'm going to apply for it. And so I did apply, and I went up and interviewed, and was given the job. One of the people on the interview committee about 2 weeks later gave me his folder, and I read it, all the interviews they did, and I went home and I told my wife, I said, you need to understand, I got this job here not because we knew Dick Engle, but because I was the most qualified.
Wow.
And it's worked out very nicely for 25 years.
Yeah.
I should have mentioned that Dick Engle was my boss in Japan.
Oh.
That's why he knew who I was and where I was.
I see.
He was a retired CEC officer.
Uh-huh. That's interesting. And so so you did end up at Rutgers then, and what year was that?
1998.
Okay, so we've jumped about 30 years, and I'm going to back up on you a little bit because I want to ask you a couple of other questions. Sure. Did in the Navy, and particularly when you went to Japan, did you receive any cultural or language training?
Did not.
Okay.
Did not. I was, as I flew over there, I thought, you know, these are the people we drop atomic bombs on. I wonder how they're going to treat me as an American. Mm-hmm. And I found out that both in public meetings and in private meetings, they were very cordial. Mm-hmm.
What year was it that you were in Japan? That would have been, what, 70?
I went over just before Thanksgiving of 69.
Okay.
Because I remember eating Thanksgiving dinner in 69. Mm-hmm. All of 70, all of 71.
Mm-hmm. Did you like it there?
I loved it.
Yeah. What did you like about it?
The Naval Air Station was like getting assigned to a country club. You know, we had a runway. Mm-hmm. Our job in Public Works was to keep this old World War II base that the Japanese built that we did not bomb. It was one of the few places we didn't bomb so that we'd have a place to land when we went over.
I see.
Atsugi was the base where Douglas MacArthur went when he went over to accept the surrender.
I see.
Of course, he accepted it on the battleship Missouri.
Right.
But to actually get into Japan, he landed there.
Right. Pretty profound story about that, too, as I recall, going in unarmed. And
that's the story that I read.
Yeah.
And the rest of that story is that the Japanese people there acknowledged him and helped him. Mm-hmm. Helped him unload airplanes and all. Once I became quite interested in Japanese history. Mm-hmm. And once the emperor said, this is what we're going to do, mm-hmm. most all the people fell in line and said, okay, we're going to surrender.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And so you were treated very well by the population there also.
Very well.
And what did you learn about Japan during your time there?
Well, Japan is actually, there's 4 main islands. Mm-hmm. And together they're smaller than the state of California. Population-wise, they're very dense. But they're very industrious people, and they realized that they had to rebuild their country. And getting there in late 69, 70, I did the math, and it wasn't too far in history that World War II was going on.
Right.
And
a little over 20 years you were there.
And when you're my age now,
yes.
you realize 20 years isn't very much at all.
No time at all, isn't it?
So,
yes.
I ended up being asked to consult to a Japanese firm. Mm-hmm. You were asking about time in Japan, mm-hmm. but when I got out of the Navy and came home, and I worked for a company looking after their construction, and then I went back to graduate school for 4 years.
Oh, okay.
And I went over to UT Dallas.
Okay.
And I got a Master of Science in Management Science, which meant corporate finance. Mm-hmm. And then I stayed on to get a degree in a Master of Arts in International Studies. Oh. And concentrated on Japan. So that all worked together very well.
Now, did your experience in Japan, is that what led you to focus on Japan?
I think so.
Yes. And did you go back?
I did go back. I took a semester off and went back. And one day I wanted to go buy a lens for my camera. Mm-hmm. And so I went to the camera store. And when I unpacked my lens, I recognized the packaging as something unique. Mm-hmm. To tell a short story, we're all familiar with polystyrene cups that we drink coffee in.
Yes.
But if you grip that cup too hard, that polystyrene will just crumble and crack.
Right.
But if it had been made out of polyethylene, it would have been very resilient. And the Japanese figured out how to make the polyethylene out of beads, just like the polystyrene was made out of beads. And other companies in this country knew how to make polyethylene foam, but they extruded it in one big piece, not in little beads. And so when I recognized this, I started inquiring as to who the company was. And unfortunately, my visa ran out the next day.
Oh, gosh.
So I had to leave, but I left my name and phone number with the store owner and got back during the holidays, much like right now. And one day my telephone rang, and it was the New York office of this Japanese chemical company. And they said, we understand you're interested in our bead process, and we would like to talk to you. And I said, well, fine, when? And they said, well, we're in Dallas right now. So I remember I took them to a Japanese restaurant to have lunch. What was the name of the Japanese restaurant? Over on Greenville Avenue.
Okay.
And so what they wanted was, they wanted the U.S. military to test their product for its dynamic cushioning ability. And they wanted it to be compared to a product that Dow Chemical made. Now, they already knew how the two foams behaved. But they didn't. They wanted the military to publish it to give credibility that their product was better.
Right.
And so I did. I took that on and went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and ultimately, and it wasn't very quick, but ultimately the Air Force did publish a document, and they were very happy with it. So that led to other assignments with them. They would want to talk to a professor at a university, but they didn't feel comfortable just calling him up as a person whose English wasn't perfect.
Okay.
So I would facilitate and set up meetings between the two people.
So you really did remain connected.
I
with,
did.
Yeah, that's very interesting. What can you tell me about your experience in the Navy? I'm backing up to that again to kind of close that era out a little bit. What experience or experiences did you have in the Navy that benefited you throughout your life?
Well, I had some unique experiences that all together came together.
Yes.
First of all, you're a graduate in an engineering school. You've never managed anything in your life. And as a junior officer, and that's what I was, I started out as an ensign. I got promoted to lieutenant, junior grade, and then ultimately to what the Navy calls full lieutenant. The other branches use captain for that rank, but the bars on your collar are all the same. So as the years went by, you did more and more, and it showed how to manage people, how to set up processes and all. The thing we haven't touched on is halfway through my tour in Japan, I came home on vacation. And in the military, you can fly on any any plane that's going somewhere, provided that they have space available. And so I had come home to Garland, and going back, I went through Washington State to visit with my sister. And she and her husband, my brother-in-law, took me out to McChord Air Force Base to get a standby flight going back to Japan. And that was when there were flights all the time from the West Coast going into Vietnam. And so you don't fly nonstop from the West Coast to Vietnam. And this flight was a big Douglas DC-8, which if you're not familiar with it, it looks like a Boeing 707.
Yeah.
And it was scheduled to go from McChord Air Force Base, Tacoma, Washington, to Anchorage International to get fuel, then to go to Yokota Air Force Base, Japan, and then to go on to Cameron Bay. Well, a lot of us were going to get off in Japan because that's where our duty was. Unfortunately, when we got to Anchorage, we landed and we refueled, and on takeoff, the plane crashed at the end of the runway. And I brought a book with me called Runway. Somebody decided to tell that story, and it killed 47 people.
Wow.
It totally destroyed the airplane, and a lot of the people did not get out. And something that I'm one of the few people who know is that every time I would fly on a commercial plane, and this was a commercial plane chartered to the military, I usually go sit over the wing because that's the smoothest place to go. But this time I got on, and right in the front of the airplane, in the front gallery in the front kitchen, was a very cute hostess. And I decided that I would sit up front and talk to her the whole flight. Well, the reason that has meaning to it is that most of the people who died were sitting over the wing. They could not get out in time before the plane exploded.
Wow. What was that experience like for you? I mean, was it surreal? Did you know what you needed to do? What was that like?
As we were going down the runway, it turned out that the brakes were not letting the wheels turn. And there was ice and snow on the runway, but it had been graded. And what was happening was the jets were skiing the airplane down the runway, and that heated up the tires and they blew. And it was so close to normal behavior that the pilot didn't know that he should have aborted the flight.
Right.
And at the end of the runway, he tried to rotate the plane up and fly, and it wouldn't fly. And the only thing he could do was go off the end of the runway, but we were going full speed down the runway. So your question was it surreal? We all have our own way to pray, and I had my way to pray. And when the plane came to an end, or came to a stop, it was full of military people, and so it was relatively quiet. And we all got up and moved to the exits where we could get out of it. The chute at the front door where I went out malfunctioned, and when I went out, I can still remember knowing there were people behind me coming very fast, and so I intentionally jumped to one side. I didn't have a chute to go down. And when I did, my feet went out from under me, and I fell right on my buttocks and compressed some vertebrae. And while I could move for several hours, I couldn't walk for a couple of weeks after that.
Wow.
Ultimately, I was discharged because of that injury, but I did manage to go back to Japan and finish my 2-year tour there.
And did you have any sort of realization as to how serious that was, or when did you realize that, hey, this is a serious event where people might die?
When I finally got to when we got out of the airplane, we made our way to a parallel runway where there were cars there. And I had, there was a lady who had a brand new baby. And to get from the runway or the end of the field where we crashed to the other runway where there were cars available, we had to go through a ditch, maybe 12, 13 feet. And she could not climb up the other side of that ditch with the baby in her arm.
Right.
And I can remember very clearly saying to her, "Give me the baby, you climb up, and I'll hand you the baby." And that worked out fine. There's more to that story a little bit later on.
Okay.
So we got to the parallel runway, and I commandeered. There was a car there, and the engine was running, and people got in, and I decided I would drive it, and I drove back to the terminal.
Wow.
But when your question was when did I learn how serious it was?
Yes.
Or what had happened. So in the hospital, I asked if everybody had gotten out, and they told me no, that some people had not made it. That was the first I learned that there were fatalities, because out of 212 people, a lot of us got out of the airplane.
And was it just the delay at the door, or these people having to wait at the door to get out?
I think some of the exits over the wings did not open, and of course the wings are where the fuel is, and that's one of the people and that was from Garland, Texas.
Really?
And I would have to look in the book that I gave you to get his name.
Wow.
I didn't know him, and I didn't know he was on the flight.
Yeah. That had to be a pretty traumatic experience for you.
I don't have any problem flying. I didn't have any problem flying. They kept me in the hospital up there a few weeks, and then they flew me to Corpus Christi, which is where the Navy has a hospital. And I didn't have any problem on those flights. I do remember we were on stretchers flying down. It wasn't that we climbed on and got a seat.
Right.
And so when the pilot came by, I reached out and took his arm, and I said, Captain, I'm not a pilot, but if you get halfway down the runway and this thing doesn't fly, shut it down and try it again. I remember saying that to him.
I'm sure he appreciated
Sure he did too.
your advice. Did you lose anyone close to you either at that time or at any time during your service? Did you lose anyone close to you?
There was a playmate of mine that lived up the street from me. His name was Danny Rogers. And Danny joined the Marine Corps, and I read where he died in Vietnam. I wasn't anywhere with him when it happened.
That's the only friend that you remember?
Yes.
Or acquaintance that you remember?
Yes.
And how long, you said you were in the Navy for 4 years?
4 years.
And so what year did you discharge from the Navy?
I got out about this time in 1971.
Okay. And immediately upon discharge, were you still in Japan at that time? Had you gone back to Japan?
I had gone back to Japan.
Okay.
The people in Corpus Christi came to me and said, we're going to discharge you with a 50% disability. And I said, well, why don't you send me back to Japan and let me finish my tour out there, then discharge me with a disability. And they said, we don't have the money to send you back to Japan. And I said, that's not a problem. Just put me back in a leave status and I'll get my own way back. And I did. And
wow. That's commitment.
So I did stay another year and working for this man who ultimately hired me at Rutgers University.
Right, right. So were you married or in a relationship during this time?
I was young. I was a bachelor and could date pretty Japanese girls.
Right, right. And you had that sharp-looking Navy uniform, so
right.
That helped, I imagine.
I guess it did.
How did you communicate with your loved ones? For instance, when did you tell your mother about the incident in Alaska?
I called her from going back to where I commandeered this car and loaded it up with people and drove it back to the terminal. Once we got in there, you could see that people were being attended to. And so I picked up the phone and whoever was on the other end, I said, would you please treat this as a priority call? And I called my mother Colette. I remember. And so I told her what happened. I said, there's been an accident up here. And so as not to upset her, I said, I'm okay.
Right.
I mean, I wasn't. I had a broken back and a broken sternum, but
wow.
I said, but you should call the Bachelor Officers Quarter at McCord Air Force Base, because that's where my sister and my brother-in-law were spending the night. They were the ones who took me out to get me on the plane. And I said, they may not have heard about this yet, and once they hear about the flight that crashed, they'll know that I was on it.
Right.
So call them, tell them you talked to me, and tell them that I'm all right. So that's how that got relayed to the family members.
So not only did you have the compression injury to your spinal cord, but you also had a broken sternum?
I did, yeah.
Wow.
What you do when you have a broken sternum is you learn not to sneeze, because there's tremendous pressure from your lungs on that, and you only sneezed one time. The pain was so great that you just don't sneeze anymore.
Wow. So how long did it take you to heal from all that?
Well, to heal completely, it took several years probably. I can still feel some pain, but I was in a hospital. I guess I was there 2 months, 3 months, until I got to go back to Japan. I was fortunate. I was hurt, but I was fortunate.
How did you deal with stress? Just the general stress of being in the military and doing an important job.
I didn't find it stressful.
Really?
I didn't find it stressful at all. The thing that we've overlooked is, when did I even think about the Navy and the Seabees?
Right.
And so go back to 1958, and I was at the Village Theater in Highland Park watching the movie South Pacific. And if you're familiar with that story, there's Seabees in that story.
Yes.
So in 58, I'm an 8th grader. And I said, I think I want to be in the Seabees.
Really?
And so ultimately, that's where I ended up.
All based on a musical.
That was the start of it. I do believe it was.
Right. And you served altogether for 4 years. Were you in the reserves after?
Well,
your
I was a
active
Naval
service?
Reserve officer on active duty.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And once they discharged me because of the injury, then I was no longer obligated to serve anymore.
I see. Okay. And the rank that you left the service with was lieutenant?
Navy Lieutenant, 03, officer level 3, which the Army and the Air Force call captain.
Right. And what medals or citations were you awarded?
If I get my telephone out, I have my DD-214 on it, and we as a battalion were awarded a lot of medals for what we did. So the Vietnam Service Ribbon, National Defense Ribbon, Unit Citation, and actually later on when I got to New Jersey, I got awarded 2 more. But I need to make clear, these were awards given to people in general.
Yeah, service-related awards.
Yes.
But you did show me your cap, and your cap has the Vietnam ribbon with, 3 campaigns?
3 campaign stars on it, and that's just a matter of you being there when they redesignated a new campaign. But I think the one that most Seabees do take pride in is that we're authorized to wear the Marine Corps Globe and Anchor, because we work side by side with Marines many, many times.
Are there any specific experiences or people that you remember that made you laugh?
Made me laugh. Probably if I think for a while, something will come up. When we were in Puerto Rico, we were 50 miles outside of San Juan, and I would go in, and once I went to the Sheraton Hotel, and they introduced me to their entertainers at night. And it was a 4-man singing group, sang songs that were relevant back in the 60s. And they said, we'd be glad to come down. You know, you come up and pick us up and take our instruments down. But we don't have any girls in our act. And we have long hair, as you can see. And we're not too sure about getting up in front of the military. So go to the hotel next door, the Condado Beach, and talk to whatever the man's name was, Jim Jones. And he's in charge of the Minsky's Burlesque show there. And tell him I sent you, and see if he would loan us just 1 or 2 of his showgirls just to be on stage with us. I want to emphasize that back then, Minsky Burlesque, you take your mother to, you take your minister.
Oh, is that
to.
right?
There was nothing, there's nothing obscene about it at all. And when I got over there, this guy, Jim Jones, said, well, sure, I'll loan you a couple of showgirls, but can I bring the whole show down?
Oh, wow.
And so he said, what made me laugh, I had to go back and tell the chaplain and the commanding officer that we're going to have this Minsky show down here. And the commanding officer said, you take me to it and show it to me before. So we drove in one night and went. That just comes to mind as a humorous experience.
And did he, so he approved?
He approved because there was nothing I mean, there's a little skin, but nothing risque about it.
Right, right. Was there anyone who served with you that influenced you?
I would say Richard Engel, the public works officer in Japan, and later the vice president of facilities at Rutgers University. Dick was just the personification of moral rectitude.
Really? That's a pretty high compliment.
He deserved it. I delivered his eulogy. He passed on a few years ago.
Oh, wow.
And he deserved it.
What reminds you of your time in the service? Any smells, sounds, food?
Japanese food.
Yeah.
Reminds me of being in Japan.
And anything else?
Anytime you're at an airport, the kerosene fumes out of the jet engines.
Yes.
That reminds me.
Yes, for sure. Now, when you came back, you had been overseas. You had some Vietnam connection, although brief. What was your reception coming home like?
I never experienced anything negative. I've heard about it. I've read about it, but I never had any negative experience myself wearing my uniform to get back home, to get up to Washington State to spend Christmas with my family, and then to fly back down to Texas. I didn't have any.
Never at all. And so let's go in a little bit about what you did after you served. We've talked a little bit about that, but let's give it some chronology.
Well, after I got out of the Navy, I was a civilian. So a restaurant company was advertising for a project manager, and I interviewed, and I lived in Dallas, but I looked after projects out in the Carolinas and in Florida. And after that, that's when I decided to go back to graduate school for 4 years.
I see. Okay.
And the UT Dallas was just beginning. I went to UT Dallas when we could have grown corn in the land next to it. In fact, somebody probably was growing corn out there. I'm amazed to look at UT Dallas today.
Yes.
At what they've done.
Yes.
And so after graduate school, I'd spent 4 years there, and I said, well, it's really time to go out and make a living. I was still a bachelor, and I saw an ad in the Dallas Morning News. It was a very small ad from a major Fortune 500 company that said, we're looking for an engineer with an interest in international business. And I said, that's me. And so I applied, and I went down and I interviewed, and I remember the vice president I interviewed with said, well, you could do my job. I'm not going to hire you. and always being somewhat quick in my thinking, I said, if that's the case, just take your job and divide it in two. You keep the part you like, and you give me the part that you don't like.
Right.
Well, he didn't do that.
Oh, he didn't? Seemed like a pretty good proposition to me.
The best I could think of on short notice.
Right.
And so I shook his hand and I left and went home. And a few weeks later, they called me back again and said, do you care? This was the corporate office of a big corporation. Do you care if we send your resume to our other companies that we own? I said, no, feel free to. And so they did send it to one, and they ended up hiring me and sending me to Buffalo, New York, where their research center was. And that's where I met the lady that I married. We've been married for 43 years.
Oh, I see. Now, how did that come about?
I worked in the research center doing special projects, and she was a secretary there. And they had, that's back when word processing was done on cassette tapes. And it wasn't done on one cassette tape. You'd fill up one, you'd have to do it to the other. And so I had to work with her on things I wrote. She had to transcribe. And so that's how we met there. So we married a year later.
Wow. Okay. And where was that?
In Buffalo, New York.
Is that right? Is that where she is from originally?
She's from Virginia, but her dad worked for General Motors in Buffalo. So this company sent me down to Charlotte, and they later sent me back to Dallas. So I spent 5 years all total with them.
What year was this? What year are we talking about?
We're talking about, have to get the year straight, not mixed up with Rutgers. The latter part of like 78, 79,
Okay.
81, 2, and 3.
And so when did you, well, I guess, when did you leave that and move to the next job?
I left that in 83 when one day they walked in and told me that they thanked me for what I'd done and said, we really don't have anything else for you to do. and go with this gentleman, he'll help you do your resume. And I remember saying, well, before I do that, you do remember that this company has donated my services to the Richardson Independent School District to help with their international business class. And it took the guy who was dismissing me by surprise. And so they called me and said, well, would you just keep doing that for us and just send us a bill? My only regret was that I didn't triple the bill that I sent them.
Highest paid teacher in America or something.
I'll tell you what happened. I still remember the lady's name, Mrs. Williamson. And when I got there one day, she said, this is the final exam I'm going to give my students. Would you sit down and take it? And I did, and I made 100 on it. But I was glad to see a high school. I was glad to see a high school had something in the way of international business for their students.
Right. That's pretty forward thinking.
Right.
How did you end up back in Texas then? Because you'd been to New York and New Jersey and...
Well, this calendar year, which is 2023,
okay,
I will have had 25 years that service with Rutgers so I could retire.
I see.
And I did retire officially August the 1st.
Oh, okay.
And with built-up vacation time, I stopped going to work in about mid-June. And my wife had always told me, by that time our daughter had gotten married here in Arlington, and had come down here and gone to work for UTA.
Oh, really?
And, in the engineering school. And so she told me, jokingly, she said, when the first baby comes, I'm leaving you. She said, I'm not divorcing you. You're welcome to come with me, but I'm going to where the baby is.
Right.
But seriously, we all came down Christmas a year ago, and we found a house to buy. And I went back up, and we sold our house in New Jersey. And so this is how we ended up in Arlington. This is where the grandbaby is.
I see. Well, that's a good reason to come. And your daughter, you said, works for the engineering school.
Yes.
What does she do for them?
I should be able to answer specifically what she does.
But you're here for the grandbaby.
I'm here for the grandbaby, right.
Very good.
They gave her a nice raise recently, so whatever she does, she must do it well.
She does it well. Okay, well, at least that. Is there any advice that you have for young people who are entering the military?
Go get a degree first and get a commission. That I would advise.
Yes, yes. And your experience working with the Navy, some with the Army, some with the Air Force, some with the Marines, would you stick with the Navy?
I think a person would have to decide what interests them. If they want to fly, they can do it either in the Navy or in the Air Force. And when I went down to the Navy that winter before I graduated, and I went down to the recruiting station, I can remember they said, "Why do you want to join the service?" My answer was, "Well, I think everybody should serve their country." And then I said, can you tell me what I would be doing as a young naval officer? And I remember very clearly saying, because I don't want to be Ensign Andrews on an aircraft carrier in charge of Coke machines in the nightly movie.
Right.
If you go back earlier to this interview,
Yes.
you'll find that the first thing they gave me when I went over to Vietnam with the Navy CB Battalion was, they told me, be sure we don't run out of beer and soda.
Right.
And after I went back to my bunk area, my hooch, I sat on my bed and put my head in my hands, and I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I laughed.
You're right.
I laughed.
Yeah, there are worse jobs, I suppose.
Oh, that does remind me of one incident. So I mentioned that after graduate school, I went to work for this large corporation, had its headquartered here in Dallas. And they moved me to Buffalo, and then they moved me to Charlotte, North Carolina.
Okay.
And this was about I'm not going to get the year right, maybe 88. And that was when people were first acknowledging Vietnam veterans.
Right.
So the city of Charlotte, North Carolina came to the president of our division and mentioned that there was going to be a parade and they'd like to have Vietnam veterans represented for the first time. And so they told us, those of us who wanted to go down could march in the parade. I certainly did want to go down. I had a very good friend who was in the same time I was, but he never left Europe. And he said he wasn't going to go down to the parade because he didn't feel that he needed to be acknowledged for anything. So just before we left Chuai, I had 2 E4s that reported to me. And they came and they asked me if I could get the commanding officer to authorize free beer and soda next Sunday because they wanted to throw a little party for the battalion before we left. And I can remember saying to him, Miles, we're 500 men in our battalion. That doesn't go with the word little party. Well, you see, sir, Ayers and I have gotten 13 cases of steaks, and it's all on ice here. If the CO will just authorize the beer and soda, we can cook the steaks.
Right.
So I went and got authorization to give away the beer and soda. So now, go on beyond that, when I had been through graduate school and gone to work for this large corporation and met the lady who was going to be my wife. And I go downtown Charlotte, North Carolina, and we're all queuing up for this parade. And I'm talking to this retired Navy Chief Petty Officer. And it turns out that as we chatted with one another, we realized we were both at this Chuai base at the same time. And when I told him I was with the Seabees, he said, oh, I remember the Seabees. Said, let me tell you, see how the story went. He said, I called upon them to build some things for us, and they said that they would, but that since I was in the supply department, that I'd have to throw in 13 cases of steaks. And these are the 13 cases of steaks that I just told about on this little party for the battalion. Small world.
Yes, there's so many stories like that. I don't think people realize how many, particularly in the military, what a small world it is. Is there anything that you would like to add to our conversation that we haven't talked about?
One of the things that I brought to this interview just to show when I retired, they came to me, the people that I worked with, saying, do you want us to throw a party for you? And I said, no, not really. I said, if you can get the Waldorf Astoria in New York, I'll attend a party. But other than that, let's just have my last day here and shake hands and say goodbye.
Right.
So on my last day in the office, my boss came up and he told a white lie to me saying I needed to come with him. He wanted to show me something out of this window in the parking lot. So I got up and followed him. What he did was he led me to a conference room where my colleagues were there. They had a nice cake and coffee and all, and some guy was there and roasted me, and other people said nice things and all. But my job was to represent Rutgers in contracts with architects and with general contractors. We were on opposite sides of the table, so to speak. Sometimes I tell people my job was to keep those other people from stealing from the university.
Right.
And but there was a contractor there who gave me a card, and I'll show it to you. You can read it. But I mean, I expected to get cards from the people I worked with. I didn't expect to get one from a contractor. And I don't plan to ever lose it. And I've told my wife to keep it for my granddaughter because I wanted to know about her granddad. But it was it's over there, and it's a very, very nice complimentary card about how fair I always treated everybody. And for that, I am appreciative of it, and I certainly want my grandchildren to see it.
Yeah, it's to have your character acknowledged in that way is so rare and so important.
It is.
Yeah,
it is.
And that's your legacy. I understand that. That makes sense.
I always got good marks on my efficiency reports in the Navy, but there were two areas that I always got marked as high as you could be marked. And one was in moral courage, and the other was in innovation.
Right.
And so I agree with that, by the way. But where did I learn to? Moral courage was to do what was right without regard to personal consequences. And that means if you screw up, you stand up and you take responsibility for it. But where did that come from? It had to come from my parents.
Sure.
Had to.
Yeah. I want to hit on that before we close about losing your dad when you were in college. Were you close to your dad?
Absolutely.
And so the long-term impact of the loss of your dad that early, how old was he, first of all, when he passed away?
He was 60. I was 19.
Oh, wow. And you said he was out on the golf course?
He worked for the Army, and they would send him to different facilities to audit. And they'd send him over to Fort Worth to audit something over there. And after work, apparently, he'd gone out on the golf course.
Oh, wow. And was this anything that was expected, or, I mean, did you know he had a heart condition?
He survived 2 heart attacks, and this third one got him.
I see. I see.
I didn't contemplate on it as a young person.
Yeah.
You just don't think that much about
Right.
it.
You don't think a lot of, when you're 19, you're not thinking a lot about death, I don't think. How did it impact you for the rest of your life? You mentioned that time at UT with that professor, but what other impact did it have on you?
Well, if there was any good news about it, he traveled a lot. And so we were accustomed to him not being home at night.
I see.
And so coming back from school and him not being there was, it could have been worse. He could have been someone who came home every night and suddenly didn't.
Yeah.
So.
And how'd your mom handle it?
She handled it probably better than I acknowledged when I was young. In hindsight, I realized the mortgage got paid up for the house, and he was a federal employee, so there were some benefits there. But she got aid to dependent children, which I think is what they called welfare back then.
Oh,
and,
she did?
I mean, that was just the law. And so back at school, I ended up, I washed dishes at a girls' dormitory. I drove a bus for that girls' dormitory. I was a counselor at an off-campus dormitory, and the lady there gave me free room. So,
oh, wow.
For doing things around the dormitory for her. And as I've told my daughter and my wife, I never missed a meal. And at that time, we were going to college for $50 a semester.
Oh, wow.
Not $50 a credit hour. The tuition was $50 a semester. And by the time they put fees on it, we'd end up writing a check for $90-something every semester.
It's amazing.
I'm not sure how young people
I'm not
do
sure
it
either.
today.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say I thank you for agreeing to be interviewed, and I didn't ask about the Lions Club. How did you end up a member of the Lions?
So I retired August the 1st in New Jersey and came here. And one day I was eating at a Whataburger, and I was wearing my Navy cap. And as I got my food and sat down, there was a member of the Lions Club sitting at a table. And he looked up and he called to me and asked me to sit down with him. And that's when he talked about the Lions Club, and that's how I got interested in that.
Any other organizations that you're a part of?
No.
Any veterans organizations?
No. I do go to the roll call luncheons over in Fort Worth.
Right.
And all.
But that's it. No VFW. No.
I've never joined any of those organizations.
Just not any aversion to it. Just never happened.
Right.
Would you have joined the Lions Club had that guy not approached you?
No, absolutely not. He was the catalyst for making that happen.
I see. Well, I wanted to acknowledge that because that's where we met. So I wanted to bring that up as well. But as I was saying, I really appreciate the time that you spent telling your story, and I look forward to going through some of the things that you brought with you so we can see what we can include in the video portion of this interview. So thank you very much.
I've
I really
enjoyed
appreciate it. Thank you so much.